Dead Man's Watch. Part 1. On that gloomy October day, when I received the news of my eccentric Uncle Ebenezer's death, nothing foreshadowed the horrors that would soon befall me. I, Jonathan Graves, a young man of 28, was never particularly close to this strange relative. My uncle lived as a recluse in his old mansion on the outskirts of town, and the family only saw him on major holidays. The news that I was the sole heir of Uncle Ebenezer took me by surprise. Even more surprising was the strange condition of the will. I had to personally come to the mansion and receive from the executor's hands an item that my uncle considered his most valuable possession. I must admit, the thought of traveling to this gloomy house filled me with vague unease. I remembered it from my childhood, an enormous Victorian building with tall pointed windows and turrets that seemed carved out of a nightmare. But curiosity and, I won't hide it, the hope for a generous inheritance outweighed my fears. When I arrived at the mansion, it was already dusk. The gloomy sky, covered with leaden clouds, seemed to press down on the earth. Gusts of wind drove dry leaves along the path, which rustled underfoot like muffled whispers. The door was opened by a tall, gaunt man with a haggard face. He introduced himself as Mr. Crawford, Uncle Ebenezer's executor. His watery eyes looked through me as if I were a ghost. "Come in, Mr. Graves," he rasped. "I've been expecting you." Inside, the house was even more oppressive than outside. Heavy drapes on the windows let in almost no light, and the rooms were shrouded in semi-darkness. The air was stale and smelled of dust, as if the house had not been aired out for many years. Mr. Crawford led me to my uncle's study, a spacious room filled with bookshelves and strange mechanical devices whose purpose I could not guess. "Your uncle was a man of unusual interests," said the executor, noticing my surprised look. "He devoted his life to the study of the mysteries of time and death." I wanted to ask what he meant, but Crawford was already opening a massive safe hidden behind one of the bookshelves. From the dark depths of the safe, he took out a small wooden case and solemnly handed it to me. "Here it is, your uncle's inheritance, his greatest treasure and his greatest curse." With trembling hands, I opened the case. Inside lay a pocket watch of astonishing beauty. Its case was made of time-tarnished silver and decorated with intricate engravings. But the strangest thing was the dial. Instead of regular numbers, it bore mysterious symbols resembling runes. "Is this a watch?" I asked, unable to take my eyes off the mesmerizing object. "Oh, yes," Crawford replied with a peculiar intonation. "But it's not just a watch. It does not measure time, Mr. Graves. It measures life." Part 2. Mr. Crawford's words hung in the air like a leaden cloud. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The executor sighed and sank into a chair. He looked incredibly tired and somewhat drained. "Your uncle acquired this watch many years ago from a wandering antiquarian. The man claimed it had the ability to show how much time a person had left to live. Ebenezer, being a scientist and a skeptic, laughed at this. But out of curiosity, he decided to test it." Crawford paused, as if gathering his thoughts. His gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, as if he was seeing ghosts of the past. "He gave the watch to his old servant," the executor continued, after a pause. "The hands began to move, counting down the time. Exactly 1 week later, at the very moment the watch stopped, the servant dropped dead. Heart attack, the doctor said. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, The watch in my hands suddenly seemed incredibly heavy. It must be a coincidence, I muttered. Ebenezer thought so too. Crawford nodded. He conducted several more experiments. On animals. On terminally ill patients in the hospital. Every time the watch was accurate. It never failed. But how is this possible? I exclaimed. It contradicts all the laws of science. There are things beyond science, Mr. Graves, the executor replied grimly. Your uncle spent the rest of his life trying to unravel the mystery of this watch. He studied ancient texts, traveled to the most remote corners of the world, consulted occultists and mediums. But the more he learned, the greater his horror grew. Why? I asked, although part of me didn't want to know the answer. Because he realized that the watch doesn't just show the time of death, it determines it. I felt the blood drain from my face. Crawford continued, and each of his words seemed to nail the lid of my sanity's coffin. The one who possesses the watch can set the time of anyone's death. But there's a price to pay. There's always a price to pay. What price? I whispered. Your own life, Crawford replied. With each use of the watch, the owner's life shortens, and eventually, the watch claims the owner himself. Part 3. I don't remember how I left Uncle Ebenezer's mansion. It's all a blur. I only remember gripping the watch case so tightly that my fingertips turned white. When I returned home, I locked myself in my study and sat for a long time, staring at the cursed object. Part of me wanted to throw it away, drown it in the river, bury it so deep no one would ever find it. But another part was fascinated. Power over life and death. Isn't that what everyone secretly desires? For several days, I avoided touching the watch, trying to live a normal life, but thoughts of it haunted me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My entire being was fixated on this ticking nightmare locked in my desk drawer. On the 5th day, I gave in. With trembling hands, I took out the watch and opened the lid. The hands were frozen at midnight. I took a deep breath and held the watch to my ear. Silence. Not a sound. As if the mechanism was dead. And then, just as I was about to set it aside, I heard it. A quiet, barely perceptible sound. Not ticking, no. More like a whisper. As if thousands of tiny voices were murmuring in an unknown language. Mesmerized, I brought the watch closer. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and suddenly I realized I could make out the words. Use us. Change fate. Become a god. I recoiled, dropping the watch. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud. I expected to hear the shatter of broken glass, but no. When I picked it up, it was intact, and the hands began to move. Slowly, unbelievably slowly, but they were moving. Backwards. Part 4. The following weeks passed like a feverish dream. I couldn't think of anything but the clocks. I studied Uncle Ebenezer's notes, trying to understand how they worked. I conducted experiments, starting with small animals, mice, rats, stray cats. The clocks worked flawlessly. Once wound, thinking of a specific creature would make the hands move, counting down to its death. And every time they stopped, a life ended. But the cost was terrible. After each use, I felt drained, as if part of my life force was seeping into that damned mechanism. I aged visibly. My hair turned gray. Wrinkles appeared on my face that weren't there a month ago. But I couldn't stop. The power the clocks gave me was intoxicating, stronger than any wine. I felt like a god, able to give life and take it away at will. Soon, mice and cats weren't enough. I started experimenting on humans. First on terminally ill patients in hospices, I told myself I was easing their suffering, then on random passers-by, just to test the limits of my power. Each death devastated me, but I couldn't stop. The whispers of the clocks grew louder, more insistent. They demanded new sacrifices, more power. And then the inevitable happened. My best friend, Charles, suspected something was amiss. He came to my house demanding answers. He threatened to go to the police. I panicked. Out of control, I grabbed the clocks and wound them, thinking of Charles. The hands started moving, counting down his last minutes of life. He died before my eyes. He collapsed, unaware of what had happened. And I felt a huge chunk of my own life ripped out and consumed by the insatiable clockwork mechanism. Part 5. After Charles died, something inside me broke. Horror at what I had done mixed with a monstrous, unnatural satisfaction. I became a recluse, hardly ever leaving the house. I covered the mirrors with fabric. I couldn't bear to see my aging, worn face. But the clocks continued to whisper. They demanded new sacrifices, new strength, and I, God help me, I couldn't refuse them. I started going out at night, hunting for victims in the dark alleys. Beggars, drunks, prostitutes. No one noticed their disappearances, and the clocks grew stronger, hungrier. But the more lives I took, the faster my own slipped away. I felt death closing in, heard its footsteps behind me, and I understood that soon, very soon, the clocks would demand their final payment. In desperation, I began searching for a way to rid myself of the clocks. Part 6. In my frantic endeavor to rid myself of the watch, I turned to the same dark forces that I believed had created it. I attended spiritistic seances, consulted occultists, studied ancient grimoires, all in vain. The watch seemed to have become a part of me, a curse from which it was impossible to escape. One night, as I sat in my office staring blankly at the ticking nightmare in my hands, it hit me. If the clock was feeding on life force, perhaps I could drain it by channeling its power into myself. With trembling hands, I brought the watch to my ear. The whisper that had already become so familiar sounded again. Use us. Become immortal. Take all lives. No, I whispered back. No more. I'm taking my own life. I focused on the thought of myself and began to wind the clock. The hands trembled and slowly crept back up. I felt a chilling coldness spill over my body. Each turn of the hands sucked years of life out of me. But I didn't stop. Hour after hour, I kept winding the clock, feeling my life drain away. The skin on my hands shriveled. My hair turned completely gray and began to fall out. I watched my reflection in the window pane turn into a withered mummy. When the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, I realized it was the end. The clock in my hands trembled, as if in agony. And then, it stopped. At the same moment, I felt something inside me tearing. With a last effort of will, I rose to my feet, staggered, and collapsed to the floor. The watch fell out of my hands and shattered. In the silence that followed, I heard a multitude of voices, the whispers of all the souls I had sent into oblivion. They were calling out to me, and I knew it was time to answer for all of them. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me were the shards of a clock on the floor. Was it just me, or was it the outline of a face contorted with horror and agony? My own face. Part 7. Epilogue. Inspector Harris wearily rubbed his nose. He had been studying the crime scene for 3 hours now, but the picture of what had happened only grew more perplexing. The body of the man found in the study of the old mansion was peculiar. It appeared incredibly aged, almost mummified, although neighbors claimed they had seen young Mr. Graves perfectly healthy just yesterday. But the strangest thing was the shards of a clock scattered around the body. Each fragment seemed to glow dimly from within, with an eerie, lifeless light. "Sir," called out the young constable, "we found this in the deceased's desk." He handed the inspector a bundle of sheets covered in writing. Harris quickly scanned the first few lines and felt a chill run down his spine. "I, Jonathan Graves, write this confession in the final hours of my life." The inspector swallowed hard and continued reading. With each line, his face grew paler. When he reached the end, his hands trembled. "Destroy this," he hoarsely ordered the constable, "and gather all the clock pieces. We must ensure they are never pieced together again." Yet, even as he left the house, he thought he heard a faint, barely discernible whisper coming from the evidence bag. "Use us. Alter fate. Become a god." Inspector Harris quickened his pace, trying not to dwell on the sudden urge to look inside the bag and touch the shards. It was just his imagination playing tricks, wasn't it? Wasn't it?